Happy Monday, Bio47. I hope sheltering in place is going well for all of you all and that you're staying healthy and that you now have plenty of time to think about the nervous system, because today we're finishing chapter 13 about nervous tissue and working our way through chapter 17, divisions of the nervous system, with particular focus on the autonomic nervous system, which is further subdivided into the sympathetic nervous system. That's your rest and digest nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for that fight or flight response. So first, just a reminder that the nervous system is anatomically divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, everything that's encased in bone, and it's responsible for integrating, processing, and coordinating sensory input and motor output. And it's the seat of intelligence, memory, learning, and emotion. The peripheral nervous system is all of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves that travel through the body. They provide sensory information to the central nervous system. That's the afferent division. And the efferent division carries motor commands away from the central nervous system. Last time we talked, I talked about the distribution of gray and white matter within the central nervous system. And we said that where you find collections of neuron cell bodies, so that's going to be gray matter, so that's cell bodies and dendrites, and this is where information is being received and processed. These get special names. So within the central nervous system, the gray matter is called nuclei. So wherever you find clusters of cell bodies within the central nervous system, those are nuclei. And when they're found in the peripheral nervous system, then these clusters of cell bodies are called ganglia. Remember that these appear gray because of the inclusions and nissl bodies within the soma, the cell bodies of the neurons. Where you find collections of axons, that's white matter. That's where information is being sent. These are the transmission lines, and they get different names according to where they are. Within the central nervous system, collections of axons are called tracts. And within the peripheral nervous system, these bundles of axons are called nerves. And remember that they appear white because they don't have those inclusions and nissl bodies, and often they're myelinated. So here's that information illustrated. On the left is the information about the peripheral nervous system, showing that where you have collections of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, it's called a ganglion, or plural is ganglia. And the bundles of axons in the peripheral nervous system are called nerves. So that white matter is called nerves. On the right is some information about the central nervous system. We already said that when you have collections of neuron cell bodies, they're called nuclei. There's another name for the gray matter of the central nervous system when it's found on the surface of the brain, and that's the neural cortex or the cerebral cortex. Within the central nervous system, bundles of axons are called tracts, and tracts are these axons that share a common origin and destination. So they connect the brain with other organs and systems in the body, and they can be ascending, that's sensory, or descending, that's motor. Particularly within the spinal cord, when you have several tracts that are forming an anatomically distinct mass, then they're called columns. So tracts that are clumped together, they're called columns. So here's, sorry for the pixelation, an image of a transverse section through the spinal cord. And you can see that there's this regular arrangement of white matter and gray matter. So unlike the brain, which has that outer layer of gray matter and then interior white matter, the spinal cord has exterior white matter and interior gray matter. And the white matter The white matter that's on the exterior is organized into columns. So these columns are named for their location. There's a ventral column on the anterior side. It's a lateral column on the lateral side, and there's a dorsal column on the posterior side. So those are tracts that are clumped together, forming that anatomically distinct mass. When it comes to the gray matter, you already know about the cerebral cortex and the nuclei. The gray matter in the spinal cord gets a special name, and it's organized into horns. So this is a dorsal horn of gray matter. Sometimes there's a lateral horn, and there's a ventral horn. So it's called horns rather than nuclei when you're in the spinal cord. And we'll talk more about that in lab. So we're getting into these peripheral nerves, these nerves that are outside of the central nervous system. And they have a really distinct structure that's going to remind you of the structure of muscles. So they're modular and they're wrapped in connective tissue, just like muscles, and they have many similar names. So up here at the top, there's the axon, and the axon is surrounded by the plasma membrane of the cell. So that is the plasma membrane. And then it's often wrapped in a myelin sheath that's from those neuroglial cells. And in particular, because we're in the peripheral nervous system, that would be Schwann cells. Around the myelin sheath is a layer of connective tissue that's called the endoneurium. So each cell is wrapped in connective tissue called the endoneurium. And then all of these axons are bundled together. And this bundle of axons is called a fascicle. This should sound familiar. And then the fascicle is wrapped in perineurium. And everything that's traveling together, making up a peripheral nerve, that's wrapped in epineurium. So the epineurium encloses the nerve, which includes blood vessels. The perineurium encloses the fascicles, the bundle of axons within the nerve. And then the endoneurium encloses the individual axons, the individual nerve fibers. So I wanted to show this table, and I'll show it a couple of times. That is the overview of the nervous system. And we talked about the central nervous system, and we are looking at it in lab. And then the peripheral nervous system is everything that's outside of the central nervous system. So the peripheral nerves, which are the cranial and spinal nerves. This is further divided up into the sensory division, where the afferent division, that's sensory neurons, they're conducting signals from the receptors to the central nervous system. And the motor, or the efferent division, and this is motor neurons, this is going from the central nervous system to the effectors, that is, muscles and glands. The motor division can be further divided into the somatic nervous system, which controls voluntary movement, and the autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary responses. And then the autonomic nervous system can be further divided into the sympathetic division, that's the flight or fight responses, and the parasympathetic division, which conserves energy. It's the rest and digest system. So first we'll talk about some of the differences between, or I'll go over some of the peripheral nervous system first, and then I'll talk about some of the differences between the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems before I get into differences between parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. So a reminder of the model that we were looking at, of how the nervous system works, that there's some stimulus, and that stimulus, illustrated in red, not part of the nervous system, triggers a sensor, and that sends information along an afferent or a sensory pathway to the brain and the spinal cord, the central nervous system. And then that transmits information along an efferent pathway, a motor pathway, to the effector. Now the effector is not part of the nervous system, and that's why it's in red. So you get sensory information, that's afferent, coming into the nervous system, and then output through an efferent line to an effector, that's a muscle or a gland. In the most simple model, you can get direct stimulation to a sensory neuron that passes information to a motor neuron that passes information to an effector. And that's why there's only 2 neurons in the line down here. So let's take a look at this type of response. And this would be a reflex. So this is a monosynaptic reflex, meaning it requires communication between just 2 neurons. So information passed at just 1 synapse. So it requires a sensor. And here the sensor is a muscle spindle in the quadriceps muscle that's sensitive to stretch. And it's detecting movement of the patellar ligament and of the patella. We'll learn more about these muscle and tendon receptors in class Wednesday when we get into sensory systems. This stretch receptor sends information along this sensory neuron. Notice it's a pseudo-unipolar neuron into this synapse along an afferent pathway. So it sends a message into the spinal cord where the synapse is. Notice that we're in the gray matter of the spinal cord because it's the cell body of this neuron right here. So these synapses will be occurring in gray matter. Then this neuron illustrated in black, that causes contractions of the quadriceps muscle and it causes the leg to move. So we have a sensor, an afferent pathway, just 1 pseudo-unipolar neuron. We have 1 synapse, this monosynaptic response, and then an efferent pathway, just 1 motor neuron, and the effector is the quadriceps muscle, causing that muscle contraction. So the structure of these peripheral nerves, these spinal nerves, they're coming from the spinal cord. And they're emerging from the spinal cord in 2 places. They emerge from the dorsal side and from the ventral side of the spinal cord. And these dorsal roots are afferent, so they're bringing information in to the spinal cord. These cells are pseudo-unipolar, and they form this structure right here, this dorsal root ganglion. Remember that a ganglion is a cluster of gray matter in the peripheral nervous system, so this is where the cell bodies are. The ventral roots are efferent, they're motor, they're carrying information away, and these are going to be multipolar. And they do this interesting thing, so they have a dorsal root, which is afferent, and a ventral root, which is efferent, and they emerge separately, but then they join together right here, they merge to form the spinal nerve, so all of the spinal nerves end up being both sensory and motor. So they're going out in different directions. In a dorsal direction, that's the dorsal ramus, and they go out toward the ventral direction, that's the ventral ramus. So we have a sensory line, those pseudo-unipolar cells with their cell bodies in the dorsal ganglia. There's an interneuron in the central nervous system. That's probably a multipolar neuron. And then the motor line, which is a multipolar cell. It has its cell body in the central nervous system, in this gray matter. It controls skeletal muscle, and it's exiting out the ventral root. And together, the sensory and the motor lines are traveling to give information about the state of the body and to control the body. So I'm bringing this back up because I want to show where we're headed again. So I'm going to talk first about this branch point right here between the somatic nervous system that controls voluntary movement and the autonomic nervous system that controls those involuntary responses. So some of the differences are illustrated below between the autonomic, that's beyond your control, and the somatic, the one that controls skeletal muscle. So I'll talk about somatic first. So somatic motor is illustrated down here. So it's the one that's below. And in this pathway, you have a motor neuron. Its cell body is in this gray matter of the spinal cord. And this motor neuron is always going to be myelinated, so it can act quickly. It's one single neuron. It's a simple pathway, and it controls skeletal muscle. So somatic motor pathways are always going to be one single neuron, myelinated, a simple pathway controlling skeletal muscle. Up above is showing the more complex autonomic motor pathway. This one is exiting out the lateral root, and its synapses at a ganglion, or a cluster of cell bodies. And then the next neuron, the next axon, is what synapses with the effector. So only the autonomic motor pathway has 2 axons that are required to reach an effector. So it's 2 axons in a chain from the autonomic motor pathway. The 2 neurons are named based on their position relative to the ganglion. The first one has its body in the central nervous system, and it's called the preganglionic neuron. So that's why this is called the preganglionic axon. You'll notice that this axon is myelinated. The second neuron is called the postganglionic neuron. Even though its cell body is in the ganglion, the axon extends outward to the effector. And for the autonomic pathway, this postganglionic axon is unmyelinated. So if you saw an image that had just one axon from the central nervous system to the effector, and it's myelinated, that's the somatic pathway. The autonomic pathway uses 2 neurons to alter the behavior of an effector. The first one is myelinated, and the second one is unmyelinated. So here again, this is illustrated up at the top, the somatic nervous system, just one neuron, that should be myelinated, causing change in an effector. And then down here, the autonomic nervous system, with the first neuron that's myelinated, has a synapse in a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system, and then a postganglionic neuron that extends to innervate cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. So in the autonomic nervous system, there's this chain of 2 motor neurons. The reason for this 2 neuron motor pathway is it allows for increasing communication and control. So it allows for neuronal convergence and divergence. That is, you can have axons from numerous preganglionic neurons that synapse with a single ganglionic cell, or you can have axons from one preganglionic cell synapsing with and influencing numerous ganglionic cells. So we can get some convergence and some divergence with this unconscious system. The autonomic nervous system is further divided up into 2 different pathways. There's the sympathetic autonomic pathway, or SANS, and the parasympathetic autonomic pathways, or PANS. The sympathetic autonomic nervous system is that fight or flight response, and parasympathetic is rest or digest. So both of them have a pre and a post-ganglionic neuron. So they have a preganglionic neuron that extends from the central nervous system, and then a ganglion where the second cell body is, and a post-ganglionic neuron that causes change in some effector. So in the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron is relatively short. It terminates just outside of the spinal cord, right next to the vertebral column. So you'll see this autonomic ganglion right outside of the vertebral column. Whereas in the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, there's still that pre and postganglionic neuron. In this case, the preganglionic neuron is relatively long and the postganglionic neuron is relatively short. Some other similarities and differences you might be able to tell just by looking at this image that there's a lot more branching in the sympathetic autonomic nervous system and no branching in the parasympathetic nervous system. This is because when you're having that sympathetic response, when you're startled, your whole body gets scared at once. It's not just that your heart starts beating faster, but your pupils dilate, your digestion slows down, you start sweating, and this branching can give that whole body response. For the parasympathetic, that no branching gives that point-to-point direct control, so you can get activity of just the stomach, activity of just the heart, activity of just the lungs. So this rest and digest has more of that point-to-point direct control. Similarities that they both share: the preganglionic fiber is always going to be myelinated, and the postganglionic fiber is always unmyelinated. The sympathetic autonomic nervous system releases norepinephrine, or adrenaline, as a neurotransmitter, whereas the parasympathetic autonomic pathway releases acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter, which is more common neurotransmitter throughout the body. I know that this is a lot of nervous system at once, so I wanted to take a video break to watch some cat videos and think about how they relate to the branches of the autonomic nervous system. So let me see if I can pull these up. This is a cat watching the horror film Psycho. And as it's watching, you can see its sympathetic nervous system firing up, accelerating the heart rate, causing pupillary dilation, raising blood pressure, causing increased respiration, widening the bronchial passages. If this cat were a human, be getting goosebumps, sweating. That was a cat showing off its sympathetic nervous system. Oh goodness. Let me see if we can find the parasympathetic nervous system. So this one is called the rest and digest system. It conserves energy. It slows the heart rate, increases activity of the intestines and the glands, and causes increased digestive activity. And we won't watch the talking cat. I'll get out of here. So this is the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. Remember that the sympathetic autonomic nervous system has preganglionic neurons that have their cell bodies in the spinal cord, and then the axons extend only a short distance to ganglia that are right outside of the vertebral column, and the postganglionic neurons extend to the effectors. The effectors would be things like the eye and the face, endocrine glands, the heart, the lungs, liver, stomach, digestive system. And the sympathetic nervous system is going to be responsible for accelerating heart rate, causing breathing to speed up, decreasing motility throughout the gastrointestinal system. So if you've ever eaten something and then you got really nervous and you felt like that food was just sitting undigested in your stomach, it really is, because the sympathetic nervous system is slowing down digestion. It's prioritizing other processes, getting you ready to fight or flight. So these sympathetic nerves only come from the thoracic region and the lumbar portions of the spinal cord. So this is sometimes called the thoracolumbar division. So just a reminder that the sympathetic autonomic pathway has cell bodies within the spinal cord, and then the preganglionic axon is myelinated, shows a lot of branching, extends only a short distance to that ganglion, and then we have an unmyelinated postganglionic fiber that can have a lot of branching and extends to the effectors and releases that neurotransmitter norepinephrine. So I've been saying that we have these autonomic ganglion right outside of the spinal cord. So where are they? So right here, these yellow structures that are right outside of the bodies of the vertebrae. That's sort of like a yellow string of beans there. That's the paravertebral ganglion chain. So it's next to the vertebrae, so it's paravertebral, and then a chain of ganglia, so it's paravertebral ganglion chain. And this is where the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons are, and they have axons that extend out to the effectors. So I'm going to show on the right here the pathways of these preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons. And this is where things get a little bit wild, as they should if you're firing up your sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So illustrated in light blue is the preganglionic neuron with its cell body in the spinal cord, and it's extending out. And my mouse is frozen right now. It extends out and it merges with the dorsal root to form the spinal nerve. Okay, thank goodness I'm unfrozen. Let me get my laser pointer. So this is the preganglionic neuron extending out through the ventral root. Remember, it's a motor neuron. And here's the dorsal root. That would be the sensory root that would be coming out the dorsal side and have cell bodies in this dorsal root ganglion. So here is the spinal nerve, which would have motor fibers as well as sensory fibers. And this first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, enters into this structure that's called the white ramus, and it synapses within that the paravertebral ganglion. So there's a synapse right here at the paravertebral ganglion. Then it's in dark blue here is the postganglionic neuron, and this one extends out through the gray ramus and out through the spinal nerve to the effector. So the preganglionic neuron enters into the spinal nerve, and then it takes this weird turn into a structure that's called the white ramus. It's called the white ramus because preganglionic neuron axons are myelinated, right? And then the postganglionic neuron has its cell body in the paravertebral ganglion, and its axon exits through a structure that's called the gray ramus. It's gray because remember that the postganglionic axons are unmyelinated. So in the paravertebral ganglion chain, you find the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons. They have unmyelinated axons, and they exit the ganglion to rejoin the spinal nerve by way of the gray ramus. Why do they overlap like this? just to make anatomy more fun, I guess. Nobody really understands why we have this U-turn of the preganglionic neuron and then wrapping back around of the postganglionic neuron. It only gets more fun from here because this is only the first way that these preganglionic neurons can branch out and then result in postganglionic neurons. Remember that we said that in the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, the neurons can branch, so they can influence multiple postganglionic neurons. What happens if they do branch? All of that is illustrated on the right here. So there are three different options. The first option is that the preganglionic neuron, here it is, with its cell body in the spinal cord, coming out through this ventral root, merging with the dorsal root to form the spinal nerve. And then it comes in through this white ramus. And then in red is the postganglionic neuron that exits out through the gray ramus and rejoins the spinal nerve. And that's the simple model that we just talked about. Another thing that the preganglionic neuron can do is to branch up and or down the paravertebral ganglion chain and influence multiple postganglionic neurons. And that's what's shown here. So it's influencing not just this postganglionic neuron, but this one down here and this one down here, up here as well. And these are exiting out through that gray ramus and rejoining a spinal nerve. The second thing that preganglionic neurons can do in the sympathetic nervous system, they can go through the ventral root and into the spinal nerve and through the white ramus and into the paravertebral ganglion chain and keep going to synapse somewhere else. So this is called a collateral ganglion. If they synapse at a collateral ganglion, then they've passed through the paravertebral ganglion chain. And this would allow for more specific sympathetic regulation. So for instance, sympathetic control on just one organ. The last option is that we have a cell body within the gray matter of the spinal cord, coming out through the ventral root, coming into the spinal nerve, entering in through the white ramus, through the paravertebral ganglion chain, and then they're synapsing and terminating in the medulla of the adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla, remember, is the center of the adrenal gland. It's not an effector organ per se, it is the postganglionic neuron. So it is of neural origin, if you recall from our discussion of the endocrine system. So the adrenal medulla is made of neurons, and like other neurons, these secrete neurotransmitters. So they're secreting the neurotransmitters of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, and that is norepinephrine or epinephrine. This is adrenaline. So in this case, though, it's not into a synapse, it's into the bloodstream, and this causes everywhere in the body to respond at once. That's that fight or flight response. So the most common pattern would be this one up at the top, where you have one preganglionic neuron that synapses in the paravertebral ganglion chain, whether or not there's branching. That's the prevailing pattern. Less commonly, you'd have the preganglionic neuron synapsing at a collateral ganglion. And one very specific case is that the preganglionic neuron synapses and terminates in that adrenal medulla. Whew. Take a deep breath and relax, because now we're in the parasympathetic autonomic pathway, and this one's a lot easier. So recall that in the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic axon is really long and myelinated, and the postganglionic axon is really short and unmyelinated, and they don't typically show branching. So the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system are almost all this preganglionic axon. So they're really long, and that means that these ganglia are going to be right next to the organs that they control. The organs that they control will be things like the eyes and the face, the endocrine glands, the heart, the lungs, the digestive system. And this is called the craniosacral division because the points of origin for these nerves are the brainstem or the sacral spinal cord, so just up at the cranial division or down at the sacral division. This one nerve right here that has all of these controls over all of these viscera, including the heart, lungs, and the digestive system, that's cranial nerve 10, which we'll be talking about in lab today. This is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve has a really strong association with the peripheral or with the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. It has inputs to multiple organs, including the heart. Overstimulation of the vagus nerve would even cause the heart to slow and stop beating entirely. So the biggest single piece of the peripheral or of the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system is the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, that rest and digest system. And here's that parasympathetic pathway again, the cell bodies within the central nervous system, a long, myelinated, unbranched preganglionic fiber, an autonomic ganglion found somewhere close to the organ that it controls, and then a short, unmyelinated, non-branching postganglionic fiber, releasing acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter and causing you to rest and digest, which I hope that you'll take a little break after you've watched this before you get a chance to dive into chapter 17 in your textbook.